Okay, so we're going to talk about classification today. There are about 13 billion known species of organisms on Earth. That's only about 5% of the species that have ever lived. New organisms are being identified all the time. We're finding them in forests, in the fossil record, at the deep ocean. These are places that we've never explored before or never cataloged these organisms. So what is classification? So classification is a way for us to identify organisms as a scientific community in a way that makes sense for everybody. The way that we do this in biology is we classify them by physical similarities or evolutionary relationships. When you classify something in biology, this is called taxonomy. So what are the benefits of organizing and classifying organisms? Well, it allows you to accurately and uniformly name organisms, living things, in a way that's not confusing. So for example, seahorses are not horses, they're fish. That's the common name that's given to them, is seahorse. If we give them a scientific name that we can use across all language barriers, we can easily identify those organisms. For instance, in English you might call this animal a skunk. But in science and biology, we call this Mephitis. This eliminates all confusion across language barriers and beyond. People have been organizing living things into categories for an extremely long time. Aristotle, for instance, did this. He divided things by where they lived, for instance. But the first serious scientific taxonomist was Carolus Linnaeus, who was a Swedish taxonomist, lived during the 18th century, and he used a naming system that we still use today. He primarily used Latin as the root words, but occasionally we use Greek when we're naming organisms as well. Carolus Linnaeus gave us the system of naming that we still use today, namely binomial nomenclature. You know the name of the human species is Homo sapiens. Well, that comes from this naming system. It's a two-word naming system based on the genus and the species of an organism, and we'll get into what those words mean in a second. Basically, the idea here is that we have a standardized naming system. Whether it's a living or extinct organism, we can use this system to identify organisms. We call this system of these two names binomial nomenclature. Here are some of the rules for the naming system. Namely, you want to italicize these names. You want to underline them when you can. Binomial nomenclature allows you to figure out which organisms are more closely related. We can see that these animals are all bears, for instance. But if you share a genus with an organism, then you're more closely related than if you don't. These names tell you the evolutionary relationship between organisms. If we understand these relationships, then we can more accurately name these organisms. For instance, of the three bears here, which two are more closely related? Think of it this way. Your genus name, the first word there, is your last name, right? So you don't have the same first name as your brothers or sisters, but you do have the same last name, and that's a big indicator that you're related to each other. This is Marley. Hi, Marley. So Marley is a member of the genus Canis. His species name is Lupus, and his subspecies name is Familiaris, which is what dogs are. Dogs are the same species as gray wolves. Gray wolves' genus is Canis, and their species name is Lupus. So this guy is a gray wolf. Actually, let me show you another example of a gray wolf. Come here, Cookie. Cookie! Cookie! Here's another gray wolf. She's shy. But Cookie is also Canis lupus familiaris. Can you sit? Cookie, Cookie! We can see that there's a lot of variation within genera. And there can be a lot of this or a little bit of this depending on the amount of time that that genus has had to evolve. So genus and species, well, what are those called? Those are called taxons. So those are groupings that we can put together to form families or evolutionary trees that help us determine how closely or distantly related two animals or plants or bacteria are from each other. These taxon come in a hierarchy, which means that some of them are bigger, they contain more organisms, and some of them are more specific. So the order of these taxonomic groups is the largest is domain. So domains, there are 3 major domains, and we'll talk about those in a second. The next one is kingdom. Kingdoms are still pretty large, but they become more specific as we go down this list. Phylum, and then class. Then we have order, family, genus, and then species. The broadest taxon is the domain, and the most specific taxon is the species. It's the most specific species. We can think about it like this, right? So at the top here we have kingdom Animalia, which is a kingdom that includes all animals. Underneath that is the phylum Chordata, which is all animals with a backbone. So you notice that the sea star is now eliminated from this. And then we could get more specific. Mammalia, those are mammals. You know what mammals are. They're covered with fur, they produce milk, they take care of their babies. Then there's the order Carnivora, which are all of the carnivorous mammals. Then there's the family Ursidae, which includes bears and all of their extinct ancestors and relatives. There's the genus Ursus, which includes a few groups of bears. And then there's the species Ursus arctos, which is just polar bears. So as we move down this hierarchy, we become more specific. A good mnemonic to help remember the hierarchy of classifications is Dear King Philip came over for good soup. Dear King Philip came over for good soup. It's an easy way to remember this usually long list of words. If you remember that sentence, you can remember the least specific to the most specific forms of classification. How is the human species classified? Well, we're eukaryotes, right? If you look at our cells, we all have a nucleus in our cells, so I don't think anybody could deny that. We're animals, so we're multicellular, we're motile, that means that we move around at some point in our life, and we ingest our food. We're chordates, we have a backbone or a notochord, more specifically. We're mammals, we're primates, which means that we have hands with fingernails. We're hominids, which means that we walk on 2 feet. We're members of the genus Homo, which means that we have big brains and we use tools. And then finally, we are Homo sapiens, which is what we are. Modern humans are Homo sapiens. We have the body proportions that modern humans do. So domains. These are the most inclusive taxon. There are 3 major domains in biology. There's the Archaea and the bacteria, which are unicellular, and they look very similar to each other in terms of not having a nucleus or organelles. And then there's the Eukarya, which includes us and a few other groups. So the Archaea are the most ancient group of organisms. They may be the first living things on Earth. They live in very harsh environments like thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, inside or around volcanoes. They can live inside of hot springs or geysers and extremely salty or acidic water. So some Archaeans here. They look very similar to bacteria. Speaking of bacteria, these are the guys that make you sick. They cause some diseases. They are found in all habitats on Earth. In fact, many people would argue that our planet, in terms of biomass, is a bacterial planet. They're found everywhere. They even live in your skin and your stomach. They are a part of you. In fact, you're an ecosystem for bacteria. They're decomposers. They are used to make all kinds of things like cheese and yogurt. This is E. coli. If you ever get food poisoning, this might be why. So the domain Eukarya is a little more complicated. We're eukaryotes, for instance. So there are a few eukaryotic kingdoms is the next subdivision underneath domain. So there's protists, or the kingdom Protista. There's fungi, which includes things like mushrooms. There's Plantae, which are the plants. And then there's Animalia, which is us, animals. All right, protists are these unicellular organisms that are eukaryotic. So some of them can be multicellular, but they're mostly unicellular. Some can be autotrophic, and others are heterotrophic. This is a big group of organisms that for the most part are microscopic. You won't be able to see them with the naked eye, with a few exceptions. All right, next up is the fungi. So fungi are multicellular, except for yeast. Yeast are unicellular. They are heterotrophs, but they're absorptive. So that means that they digest food outside of their body. They will secrete some kind of acid or something like that to help dissolve what they want to eat. They have cell walls that are made with a chemical called chitin. Plants, the kingdom Plantae, they are all multicellular. There are no unicellular plants. They're autotrophic, which means they make their own food and energy. The way that they do this is they absorb sunlight and they turn it into glucose. You know what that process is called. They have cell walls, which is a very important distinction between plants and animals. And those cell walls are made of cellulose. Animals, that's us. We're multicellular. We are ingestive heterotrophs. So ingestive means that we have to eat our food. We have to put the food inside of our body and then digest it there. We feed on other animals or plants, any food in the environment we ingest. Okay, so let's say you're looking at a genus. Most genus will have, or most genera, will have a number of similar species. Classification in science is based on evolutionary relationships. For a very long time, it was based on physical characteristics. But as evolution became a major idea in biology, scientists started to decide that we need to classify things evolutionarily. So the basis for modern taxonomy is homologous structures, which we know about, right? These are structures that have the same structure but a different function, which means that they had a common ancestor that had that structure. They have embryonic development in common with each other. They have DNA and RNA and amino acid sequences in common with each other. So what we can do is we can take this information and construct family trees. And the official name for this, the scientific name for these family trees, are cladograms. And these cladograms can show how closely related two species are to each other and when the traits that make those groups unique started to appear in this evolutionary tree. That's it for this lesson. Don't forget to push the buttons, like, comment, and subscribe.